"Edward, help!" came from somewhere to the left. A young man sitting on the warehouse steps turned around, nodding to the woman who had called him. "The truck with goods is here. Time to work." Edward. That was his name now, though he couldn't remember his real one. He knew nothing else about himself either, not his age, his parents, or where he came from. A man without a past. 2 years ago, he had found himself on a riverbank near an unfamiliar town. His head was bashed in, his clothes soaking wet, his body freezing. He had tried to piece together who he was, how he had gotten there, what had happened, but nothing came back. His mind was completely blank. The woman who'd called out to him was Helen Maroney. She sold housewares, accessories, slippers, purses, bags and shopping totes. Once a week, when the delivery truck arrived, Edward would unload it for a small fee. It was enough to get by. Helen wasn't the only merchant who needed a strong pair of hands, so the young man never went hungry. Edward lived simply. He had earned everyone's trust and respect over time. When he'd first wandered into the market 2 years ago, nameless and confused, Helen had immediately taken notice of him. She'd offered him hot tea and a bun. "Edward, will you help with the paperwork?" Helen smiled as he approached the truck. Edward nodded. "Of course." Though he couldn't remember his past life, he seemed to have experience with office work. He had a knack for spotting errors and inconsistencies in documents. The local merchants had quickly discovered this talent, and now he not only unloaded their goods, but checked their paperwork, earning a bit of extra money. "Thank you, Edward. You're a true friend." Helen often said this to those who helped her. It was one of her characteristic phrases. She was the one who'd given him the name Edward. It had been her son's name. "What happened to you? What's your name?" she'd asked sympathetically when they first met, watching him devour the bun she had given to him. The young man had just shrugged, confused. He still wasn't used to having no memories, and this void terrified him, dragging him into despair. Helen had understood without words. "Have you lost your memory?" "I think so." "My goodness. Would you mind if I called you Edward? That was my son's name." "Okay," the unfortunate man said, and felt relief to have a name at last, even if temporary. At least now he could introduce himself. "What happened to you?" "I don't know. I woke up on the riverbank. Everything before that is blank." "You should go to the police," Helen had exclaimed, wringing her hands. "And maybe the hospital too. That's a nasty bruise on your forehead. You must have hit your head hard." "No, not the police," Edward had cried out in fear. Earlier on that riverbank in the pre-dawn light, he'd had the same thought. He'd imagined going into the city, finding a police station, explaining his situation to the officers. Surely they would help him find his family, get him to a hospital where doctors could restore his memory. Everything would work out. The city wasn't far. He'd walked quickly, though passers-by gave him a wide berth, understandably so. He must have been a frightening sight. Wet, sandy, blood on his forehead. He'd entered the police station full of hope, but fled in terror, fearing even worse troubles ahead. A guard had escorted him to the duty officer, who'd listened carefully before stepping out to consult others. Several officers spoke in low voices in the next room, while Edward waited. At first he'd sat calmly, expecting help, but then he'd overheard something that chilled him to the bone. They planned to pin a crime on him. How convenient, a suspicious character with no memory. They needed a solution to a serious case that could cost them their positions, and here was the perfect scapegoat, who couldn't even remember his own past. Understanding the danger, Edward had slipped out unnoticed. He'd crept quietly through the corridors, and once outside, ran so fast the wind whistled past his ears. That's when he discovered something about himself. He could run incredibly fast. Perhaps he'd been an athlete. He never knew if anyone had chased him, but he had made up his mind. The police were not an option. A man with no memory or identification was too vulnerable. Better to keep his head down. Edward left the city the way he'd come, deciding to avoid people for a while. He spent the day walking along country roads, staying off the main highway, moving through bushes and fields. Exhausted and hungry, but worst of all, thirsty. By midday he found a lake. Though murky and muddy, he didn't care. He scooped up handfuls of the brackish water and drank. By evening, he had reached another town. Naturally, he avoided the police and anyone who might call the police. He survived on whatever he could forage. Berries, leaves. It barely took the edge off his hunger. On the third day, he ventured into town and found the market square. It was bustling, but no one paid him any attention, except Helen. Later she admitted his lost look had caught her attention. She let Edward spend the night in her market stall. She wasn't afraid he would rob her and run away. "Oh, I saw right through you," Helen smiled months later when Edward asked how she dared let a homeless man into her warehouse. "I've lived long enough to understand people well. I could see you needed help." After nights on the street, Edward slept on the broken cot in the warehouse as if it were a 5-star hotel. Calm, warm, quiet, without mosquitoes or gnats. Helen helped Edward find work. He helped unload goods for local traders, sometimes filled out supporting documents, and even prepared simple reports. Soon everyone at the market knew and respected him for his politeness, responsibility, diligence, and intelligence. Initially living in Helen's warehouse, he eventually earned enough to rent a bed at a nearby hostel. Life gradually improved and found its rhythm. With steady work, Edward could afford food, clothes, and rent. He made friends. Helen, who treated him like a son, Ben, the cafe owner, Frank, the shoe salesman, and many others. Naturally, Edward often pondered his past and future. Helen suggested several times they go to the police, but Edward refused, frightened. He felt vulnerable and defenseless before the authorities. As a man without a name, past, or documents, anything could happen to him. "Well, you just happened to meet one bad officer," Helen would say. "It happens. Not everyone is like that. The police will help you." "No," Edward would insist. He couldn't admit it even to himself, but he feared more than just the police. He dreaded what truth might emerge. What if he had done something terrible, something irreparable? Perhaps it was better not knowing. Yet Edward desperately hoped his memory would return. He also was confused by his dreams. Sometimes he saw himself in a dilapidated room with torn wallpaper, stained plumbing, cigarette butts and empty bottles strewn across the floor. Other visions showed stark contrasts: expensive furniture, elegant framed paintings, luxurious flower arrangements, a goldfish fountain, and a swimming pool's bright blue surface dancing with sunlight. And there was a girl, her face close to his, turquoise eyes, gentle, charming smile, freckles dotting her slightly upturned nose. She radiated warmth, happiness, joy. If he saw her in real life, he would recognize her instantly. Edward cherished these dreams of her. Upon waking, he wondered whether she was real, someone from his past, or merely his imagination. He wanted to believe she existed, and that they would meet again. He shared these dreams with Helen. "You're an interesting person," she would say, shaking her head. "Who knows what your past holds? These dreams of both squalor and luxury. Where's the truth? Where's the fiction?" Helen often insisted someone must be searching for him. "Young, handsome, clearly educated. You must have family. They're probably worried sick. A missing person, and you're refusing to go to the police. It's not right. As for the girl, she is your first love," she declared confidently. "You never forget your first love. Everything else might vanish from memory, but her face remains. Perhaps she's waiting too, worried, suffering. Edward knew much about Helen's life as well. She had gradually shared everything with him. Natural, given how much time they spent together working and talking. They both needed this connection, this acceptance. Helen had lost her parents early, while still studying foreign languages at college. Helen always dreamed of working in a school, teaching children and inventing new, more effective ways of teaching. Everything in her life was good, cosy, measured, planned. Her mother and father doted on their daughter and supported her in all her endeavours. And then came the disaster. A fire in their wooden cottage. At that time, Helen was in college studying, so she survived. It was hard for her to be alone, without loved ones and relatives nearby. She had to transfer to the correspondence department. She needed to work now, to provide for herself. Young Helen got a job as a saleswoman at a local grocery store. She learned to trade, counting money quickly, keeping track of goods, and communicating with all kinds of customers. These skills would prove useful later. At the time, she thought working as a saleswoman was just temporary. Her diploma was not far off. Helen planned to realize her dream of becoming a teacher, and at first she did. Helen graduated from college, got a job at a school, enjoyed the work and found the salary satisfactory. Life seemed to have settled into a comfortable routine. And then came love. He was a prominent, promising young man, already head of department at the plant in his early years. Hard-working, smart. A bit tedious, but that was the price of responsibility and dedication. Nevertheless, Helen fell in love. She knew that next to this reliable man, she would feel secure and cherished. She used her feminine charms and achieved her goal. Peter noticed her. After dating briefly, they began living together in Helen's apartment. It made sense. She had her own place, and she was tired of coming home to empty, cold rooms. Peter, still living with his parents, packed his things and moved in with her. Then came the pregnancy. It wasn't entirely unexpected. Helen had long dreamed of children and family. The news of the coming baby delighted them both. Peter proposed. They married, and soon their son Edward was born. He became Helen's universe. She had never experienced such feelings for anyone before. Peter worked and fully provided for the family. Helen happily devoted all her time to the baby. At their family council, they decided that after maternity leave, Helen would stay home with the child, teaching him, taking him to various clubs, and focusing on his health. Helen welcomed this arrangement. Though she had enjoyed working, combining school and motherhood would have been challenging. She didn't want to shortchange Edward. He was growing so fast, with so much to learn. Money wasn't a concern. Her husband provided more than necessary. It was the happiest, most carefree time of her life. She had everything: a reliable, decent husband, an adored son, and prosperity. She had plenty of spare time, which she gladly devoted to Edward. Their attention to the child bore remarkable fruit. Little Edward spoke Spanish before starting school, played chess like an adult, swam like a dolphin, and easily solved math problems. He entered school well prepared. From his first lessons, the boy amazed teachers with his abilities and knowledge. Helen was proud of her son and herself. She had raised such a remarkable boy. Peter acknowledged his wife's role in their son's success and encouraged her continued dedication to parenting. Helen embraced her role as wife and mother so completely that she forgot about her former career. Initially, Helen wanted another child, dreaming of a daughter. She didn't need her to be as capable and talented as her eldest son, just softer, more sensitive, cheerful, and warmer. Edward was like his father, a rational rule follower, stubborn and goal-oriented. Helen yearned for more warmth, empathy, and communication from him. But Edward was independent, reserved and distant. Unlike other children, he never seemed to miss his mother. Then again, why would he? Helen was always there for him. The second baby never happened, despite Helen's visits to doctors and even healers. No one found any particular problems, but pregnancy eluded her. Eventually, Helen accepted that she would have just one son. But what a son! He was the pride of the school, an excellent student, an Olympiad winner, and an athlete. He excelled at everything he attempted. And then Edward grew up. He no longer needed his mother's constant attention. Peter climbed higher on his career ladder, consumed by work. And out of the blue, Helen found herself overwhelmed by loneliness. She tried returning to school, but her qualifications had lapsed during her years at home. And then Helen got another shock. Peter left their family for a young mistress. Their relationship, it turned out, had been going on for years without Helen noticing. The woman wasn't particularly upset by her husband's actions, since they had long since grown apart. Had they ever truly been close? Now she couldn't answer that question with certainty. Edward went abroad to study, arranged by Peter, who insisted the young man would have better prospects for substantial earnings there. Helen didn't argue. She didn't understand much about it, but her heart told her that now her son was truly beyond her reach. Their relationship had always been distant, despite Helen's efforts. Now, with thousands of kilometres between them, it only worsened. Edward rarely called, and they barely communicated on social media. Helen missed him desperately. Her heart ached for her son. The pain was constant. She had spent most of Edward's life supporting him, noticing and developing his talents. Did that mean nothing to him? The mother could only take comfort in his success. She knew he owned a large, profitable business involving gas stations. Edward lived in a huge mansion, which Helen had only seen in photos, having never been invited to visit. Her son had married a beautiful woman who could have graced magazine covers. The couple showed no rush to have children, whether by choice or circumstance. Helen wasn't privy to such details. Her son remained distant, now practically a stranger. Yet Helen loved him, worried about him, and prayed for his health every evening. Edward had witnessed this a couple of times, and he couldn't comprehend how someone could move thousands of kilometres away and cut their mother out of their life. Helen was clearly a loving and caring mother. Edward sometimes wondered if he had a mother somewhere who suffered, not knowing the fate of her missing son. The thought caused him agony. His heart clenched with pity for those who must worry about him. After learning Helen's story, he became more attentive to this woman. She liked taking care of him. Helen helped Edward choose clothes and baked fragrant pies for him. Edward gratefully accepted this care, trying in turn to do something good for her. When he finished with the documents, he looked at Helen. She was laying out goods on the counter. The market would soon open for visitors. Being a day off, there would be many people. "Did you manage?" She smiled, and when he nodded, she added, "Quick as always. Well, go to Frank, he also needs help." Edward nodded and went to the next row, where Frank sold shoes. Edward had helped him lay out the goods that morning. Frank greeted his friend with his usual cordial smile. They went to work together, continuing their peaceful conversation. Frank reminded Edward of someone pleasant from his past life. The young man knew he had enjoyed talking to someone similar, but whom? His thoughts scattered whenever he tried to remember. Edward caught himself thinking about her again, that same girl from his dreams. He admired her amazing eyes, could almost feel himself stroking her blonde hair. She had said something to him, but what? Try as he might, Edward couldn't remember. It seemed to be something crucial. While screwing a crooked shelf to the wall in Frank's kiosk, Edward heard a sharp cry behind him. Fear and despair rang clearly in it. Edward spun around and immediately grasped the situation. Such incidents weren't uncommon here. At the Rose entrance stood a pretty girl in a light chintz sundress. Her hands spread in confusion, eyes frightened, cheeks flushed red. A teenager was running away from her, clutching a bag to his chest. It was Remy. Many knew him here. A drunk mother's child, he used to beg at the market as a toddler. Many gave him handouts. Helen herself often welcomed Remy, giving him tea and cookies. But Remy had changed as he grew. The cute, big-eyed, touching little boy had become a lanky, angular teenager who people pitied less. Then came Remy's bad influences, a whole gang of street kids who'd banded together. They roamed the market, pickpocketing customers. They left the merchants alone, considering them on their side, but often harmed shoppers. They hadn't been around for a while because the police would crack down on these teenagers, occasionally raiding the market. Now they were back, and Remy, completely lost, had snatched a bag from this young, defenseless girl. Without hesitation, Edward rushed after him. He needed to return the girl's bag and set this young troublemaker straight. If Remy didn't change course, he'd soon land in jail. His whole life would be ruined, though maybe there was still hope. Remy skillfully manoeuvred between rows and stalls. He knew the market like the back of his hand, but so did Edward, who stayed right on the boy's heels. Remy vaulted over the low fence, separating the main market from the warehouses. Edward followed, catching up with the teenager in the alley and restraining him. Edward was a good runner. He had discovered that during his first day of wandering, fleeing from the police station. "Take off your hands!" Remy squirmed on the ground, but Edward held him firmly. "Give me the bag," he ordered, panting from the chase. Remy reluctantly obeyed. "What are you doing?" Edward released the boy, who made no attempt to flee. He stood up, looking guiltily at Edward. "I'm out of cigarettes, and I'm hungry as well," Remy sniffled. "The market director offered to send you to boarding school. Why did you refuse? It's a secure future. Why would you rather waste your time on the street?" "I'm not interested in marching in line, breathing on command. No thanks." "Okay, go," Edward said, ruffling Remy's hair. He felt no anger toward the boy, understanding his difficult circumstances. Remy might have been better off in an orphanage as a small child. Perhaps someone would have adopted him, raised him properly. Instead, his alcoholic mother had raised him, or rather neglected him, while drinking away his child support. The boy had grown like a weed, left to his own devices from an early age. He'd eventually landed in an orphanage as a teenager, but couldn't bear the rigid structure and ran away. He'd joined other street children like himself, forming a real gang. Edward knew Remy's story was unlikely to end well. With the purse in hand, Edward hurried back to where the confused girl waited. Her face lit up when she saw her seemingly lost possession in Edward's hands. A small crowd of sympathizers had gathered around her. "Here you go," Edward said, handing over the bag. "The boy got away, threw your purse and jumped the fence. Just some kid." The girl looked at Edward with tear-dampened eyes and a smile. Then she opened her purse and began checking its contents. Edward realized she was making sure nothing was missing. Finding her money intact, she sighed with relief. "Thankfully he didn't take anything. I don't know how to thank you. It wasn't even my money. It would have taken forever to repay." Edward smiled, noticing for the first time how incredibly beautiful she was, somewhat resembling the young woman from his dreams. "A simple thank you is enough," he smiled. "No, that won't do. Let me at least buy you coffee. You worked so hard helping me." Edward agreed simply because he liked her. Her simplicity, naturalness, sincerity. She was lovely. Walking to the coffee shop at the market's far end, they chatted and introduced themselves. Her name was Claire. Edward thought the name suited her perfectly. She'd recently started working as an au pair in a wealthy people's house. She enjoyed the work, and the salary made her even happier. "It's so beautiful there," the girl chirped, her eyes burning with admiration. "Imagine a huge garden with statues, a small fountain, and a huge pool in the front yard. And the owners let me swim there in my spare time. It's just marvellous." Claire had come from the countryside to the city for college. Unfortunately, her parents couldn't support their daughter in the city, so she had to transfer to a correspondence course and look for work. She took jobs as a waitress in a cafe and a cashier at stores. Though the money was little, she had to work from morning till night. She had no energy left to study. Then her friend happened to find some job listings online that Claire hadn't considered before. Positions for maids and household helpers. The work was familiar and not difficult, but the salary was much higher than what cafes and shopping centres offered. The living conditions were like something from a fairy tale. Claire was delighted with her employers. They paid well and didn't fuss over small things. Today was Claire's first solo trip to the market. She was given a substantial amount for groceries, since there had been a recent tragedy in the family. The mansion's owner's mother had died. They needed to organise a memorial dinner for many guests, which explained the impressive sum in her purse. Then came trouble. A thief spotted her in the crowd and snatched her bag. While Edward chased after him, Claire sobbed, terrified about repaying the owners. Fortunately, everything turned out fine. "And what do you do?" she suddenly asked. "Me?" Edward shifted uncomfortably. "Well, just odd jobs at the market, part-time." "You work and study?" Claire pressed. "Well," Edward hesitated, wondering how to answer. Should he tell her the truth, that he remembered nothing of his past and survived on casual earnings? "Don't want to answer?" Claire had been so open with him that Edward decided to be honest too. "You know, I don't remember much about myself." "How is that possible?" "As you see, it's possible." Edward gradually shared his story. It was surprisingly straightforward, and the girl listened, occasionally gasping in amazement. "Well, wow!" Claire exclaimed when he finished. "Your life could be a TV series." "Yes, but the ending's still open. I still don't know who I am or where I'm from." "You need money," she said confidently. "Then you can hire private detectives to find out, since the police won't help." Edward nodded. He'd thought of this himself and had even checked detective rates, but couldn't afford them so far. "And you know what?" Claire's eyes suddenly sparkled. "I have an idea. The house where I work needs a gardener. Nothing complicated. They'll explain everything. Why don't you try for the position? The pay should be decent. You could save up for detectives in a few months. What do you think?" "What's there to think about?" Edward replied. "Maybe it really is fate." "That's great!" Claire beamed. "I'll arrange everything now. We'll take a cab there right away." "Really?" "Good," Edward nodded. "Let me help you. I know everyone here. We'll get the best quality items and save money too." They finished shopping quickly. Edward carried the heavy bags to the cab, wondering how Claire's employers expected such a delicate girl to manage alone. During the ride, she described the mansion's advantages. She clearly wanted Edward to get hired, and he found himself hoping for it too. Living in the employer's home meant no hostel expenses, and with good pay, he could really hire detectives to uncover his past. They arrived at the house's gate, tall forged iron doors that looked impenetrable. Claire touched a magnetic key to the lock, and with a distinctive squeak, the doors briefly slid open to admit them. Edward entered the garden, and Claire had been right. It was beautiful, yet somehow familiar. He must have seen a similar garden somewhere, perhaps on TV, or visited a similar place once, though that seemed unlikely. Then, like lightning, a memory flashed. Or was it from a dream? Emerald grass, a small fountain shaped like a fish standing on its tail. Claire, you mentioned a fountain. Could I see it? There is one, she nodded. I'll show you later. First, we need to take these groceries to the kitchen. Edward followed her down the driveway. He'd thought that they'd use the grand main entrance, with its ornate stucco, but she led him behind the house to a back door. Another flash hit him. He'd seen this place before. The tiled porch, massive door handle, bench along the wall. What was this place? Edward grew dizzy and paused to catch his breath. Maybe it was just the heat playing tricks on his mind. In the kitchen, that strange sense of déjà vu returned. Why did everything feel so familiar? Perhaps it was just a common layout he'd seen elsewhere. Want a snack? Claire offered, grabbing a green apple from the table's basket and biting in. But Edward couldn't eat. He felt too anxious and already regretted coming to this strange place. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't understand why. Claire munched her apple while studying him. You've gone pale. Are you all right? Edward nodded, unable to explain feelings he didn't understand himself. Claire finished her apple, tossed the core in the trash, splashed water on her hands, smoothed her hair, then straightened Edward's collar with a smile. Well, let's go. She led him through a wide door into a beautifully furnished room. And then, in this spacious living room, memories crashed over Edward like an avalanche. He swayed, gripping the doorframe to stay upright. He'd been here before, many times. He'd lived here. The paintings in heavy frames, the twisted leg coffee table, the wide staircase with smooth railings leading up, the floor-to-ceiling portrait of a tall, thin man in a stern suit, the 2 sofas, 2 armchairs in pale green fabric, the massive chandelier overhead, even the scent, a light citrus from the shelf-mounted diffusers. Oranges were Grandma's favourite. Grandma. Memories flooded back in a fresh wave. Edward's vision went dark. He looked at Claire for help, but she looked confused too, even frightened. She didn't care about the guest and his emotions. The girl hadn't expected to enter the dining room at such an important moment. The owner, his wife, and several relatives were gathered there. Claire knew only some of them, being new to working in this house. Everyone sat at the long dining table, dressed formally and elegantly. At the centre sat a grey-haired, balding man holding a stack of papers. A pair of thin-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He peered over them to scrutinise the newcomers, while others turned to look as well. Claire wanted to sink into the ground from shame. She had interrupted what was clearly a crucial meeting. She always found herself in such awkward situations, acting before thinking, as her mother always said. The girl feared he'd be punished for her carelessness. She might even lose her bonus or even her job. Anxiously, she glanced at her employer, Mr. Halford. But he wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on Edward, as were everyone else's. Claire couldn't decipher their expressions. Was it surprise? Fear? Both. Edward in turn studied those present. What he'd read on the internet had proven true. Being in this familiar place and seeing details from his past had triggered his memory's return. It happened suddenly, unexpectedly, instantly. Edward felt dizzy and slightly nauseous. He recognized everyone. No wonder. This was the house where he had grown up. He had lived here with his grandmother since childhood. The family notary at the head of the table was familiar too. He had helped Edward's family, No, not Edward's, but James's. The young man remembered his real name now. The notary had assisted the family with both inheritance and business matters, as James's grandfather owned a large company. He'd built it from nothing. His portrait adorned the living room wall, grandmother's anniversary gift that had embarrassed the modest, reserved grandfather. Grandpa was gone now. His youngest son, Scott, ran the business. Scott sat here with his wife, Paula, an unpleasant woman who'd always regarded James with barely concealed distaste. His uncle had never shown much warmth toward his nephew either. They had no children, whether by choice or circumstance, James couldn't remember. Other relatives sat at the table too. They'd celebrated holidays here and dropped by regularly. Grandmother had welcomed everyone, feeding them generously. She'd loved having friends and family around. Grandmother, why wasn't she here? An uneasy premonition gripped James's heart, pushing all other thoughts aside. "James?" One of the distant relatives broke the silence, voice uncertain. He stared at the guy, as if seeing a ghost. Murmurs filled the room. Everyone suddenly crowded around the guest, pushing aside a bewildered Claire. But Scott quieted the commotion. Rising from his seat, he approached James and studied him carefully. "He resembles him, but he could be an imposter, an inheritance hunter. We know there's plenty to inherit. We need proof that he's James." "Scott, you know perfectly well it's me," said Edward, now James. "I can see you recognize me." "I'll handle this," the notary announced. "We'll confirm our guest's identity. The will reading will be postponed until after the necessary procedures. We'll reconvene then, and I'll read the deceased's will." The words, "the deceased," cut through James painfully. Though he understood what had happened, he refused to believe it, afraid to ask the specific question. The flood of memories and emotions overwhelmed him. His breathing became laboured. Black spots danced before his eyes. Then came a voice. "James?" It was a familiar, beloved, dear voice. Someone pushed through the crowd of relatives, and he finally saw her. The girl from his dream. Turquoise eyes, blonde hair. He remembered her name. Celine. Her maid's uniform accentuated her graceful figure. Despite everything happening around him, James couldn't help but admire her. Celine smiled, her eyes bright with joy. She rushed to embrace him, and he held her close. They stood together among the confused, murmuring people. Claire blinked in bewilderment. She had summoned the other staff when she realized something extraordinary was happening. Now her colleagues stood near the wall, smiling knowingly. "James is back," the cook explained. "This is Halford's only grandson, a good lad. Everything will be right now." "James? That James?" Claire spoke in shock. She knew about the missing grandson of the lady of the house. "So I found him?" James sat in his grandfather's office, reviewing financial reports. Much work lay ahead. Scott had managed the business during his absence. Though James had missed much, he caught up quickly. He had always had a sharp mind and proper education, thanks to his grandparents' efforts. He had always known he was the son of their firstborn, Adam. James remembered his father as well as his mother, poorly. Both died when he entered conscious age. The thing is that Adam, he did not want to study. Unlike his parents' expectations, Adam never dreamed of taking over his father's business. Instead, he chose a carefree life of partying with friends. During his teenage years, he began running away from home, falling into bad company, drinking, committing petty theft, and living for daily pleasures. All of this attracted and enticed Adam, bringing him joy. His friends were just like him. His parents, seeing their eldest son heading down a dangerous path, tried desperately to save him. They placed him in clinics and sent him to long-term rehabilitation, but nothing helped. A person's nature cannot be changed. Yet despite his troubles, Adam remained kind-hearted, warm, responsive and cheerful. Though he caused his parents endless worry and heartache, they loved him deeply. Every reunion with their wayward son brought them joy. He was like a ray of sunshine for his mother and father. Meanwhile, the younger son, Scott, was the perfect child. He studied diligently, obeyed his parents in everything, and hoped to eventually take over his father's company. That would likely have happened. The company founder would have left the business to his reliable and sensible younger son. But then one day, Adam appeared at home with a baby in his arms. He looked confused and frightened. "This is my son," said Adam, gesturing to the child. "His mother has died. I don't know what to do. I'm scared. I'm afraid I won't be able to keep him safe." His parents hadn't even known their son was married. Yet they welcomed their grandson with open arms and loved him dearly. The boy seemed to inherit the best qualities from his relatives. He grew up kind, sensitive, caring and cheerful like Adam, while also being organized, responsible and intelligent like his grandfather and uncle. Adam died shortly after, falling under a bus while drunk. His parents mourned their eldest son deeply. Despite his choices, he had been their joy and their happiness. Despite this difficult time, having James was their saving grace. They raised their grandson with love and acceptance. The boy helped pull them from their abyss of despair and grief. Scott, however, was dissatisfied with his nephew's arrival in the household. The attention given to the child irritated him. Later, when James grew into a serious and promising young man, Scott grew worried. His father increasingly spoke of putting James in charge of the company. "Scott, you're already established, with a good job and everything you need. The boy's an orphan. He needs to find his footing in life. I think he should take over the company when I'm gone. He'll do well. The kid has a golden touch." The man died of a heart attack while James was still in high school, too young to run the business. The company passed to his wife, though she was only a nominal holder. Scott took control. He tried convincing his mother to change the will in his favour, but she had other plans. The elderly woman visited the family notary to draft her will. Her age was advanced, her health failing. The will, however, didn't match Scott's hopes. His mother honoured her late husband's wishes and left the business to her grandson. She also bequeathed the house to James. Scott received a substantial bank account, shares and a large apartment in the city centre. But none of this interested him. Scott wanted the business, the enterprise he'd grown attached to and considered practically his own. It seemed James would inherit everything once he finished his education and was ready. This thought infuriated Scott. He hated his nephew. He hated that James was born, that he'd captured his parents' love, that he'd become his main rival and competitor. James studied at the Economic University, graduating with honours, which delighted his grandmother. She even hosted a banquet at home, inviting all the relatives to celebrate. She was immensely proud of James. That evening, Scott wore a sour smile and glared at his nephew with hatred. His wife, Paula, had to elbow him when he looked at James with 2 noticeable daggers. But by then Scott had made up his mind. He wouldn't let this upstart take what he considered rightfully his. James should never have existed in the first place. Scott would correct that mistake. Celine, the young maid, noticed the hostile looks Scott gave his nephew throughout the evening. Being naturally sensitive and observant, she warned James about potential trouble, but he just smiled, embraced her and kissed her. "You worry too much." James said, stroking Celine's head. "Don't be afraid. You have nothing to fear when you're with me. Everything will be fine." Celine relaxed somewhat. James's words always soothed her. The young au pairs and the owner's grandson had fallen for each other at first sight. Celine had arrived nervous, trembling and shy. A village girl studying in the city, she needed part-time work, a common situation. James, home from the capital on vacation, saw the new maid and instantly knew it was fate. One look was all it took. He was thunderstruck. Such things, it turned out, weren't just for movies and books. They understood each other instinctively, felt connected even at a distance, missed each other constantly, and exchanged endless messages and photos. Their love was pure and strong. His grandmother was delighted. "Celine is a wonderful girl, tender, devoted, loving and caring. You'll be happy together. Just finish university first. You'll be head of the family soon. You need to be able to provide for your family." James agreed with his grandmother. Though separation during his studies was difficult, they managed. They stayed in constant contact and cherished their reunions. After graduation, James returned home and began learning about the company. He would soon replace his uncle as general director. He could see how uncomfortable this made Scott. His uncle had never liked him. But James had always wanted a good relationship with him. As a child, he'd tried hard to win over Scott and his wife, Paula. But it was futile. They regarded him with coldness and even disgust. That fateful evening, James received a text message from an unknown number. "Come to the river under the old bridge in the evening. There's a surprise waiting for you." James smiled, figuring it was Celine. They often arranged surprises for each other spontaneously. He had been thinking about proposing to her for a long time, wanting to make it something special. Celine was just like that too, always planning something unexpected. Now she was mysteriously asking him out on a date. But it wasn't Celine who met him in the evening twilight under the bridge. What happened next was something James wished he could forget, but couldn't. Scott was there with two muscular men whose stern faces showed no emotion. James instantly understood the situation and knew he was helpless. "Here's my good-for-nothing nephew," Scott said with a sneer. "How I've hated you all these years." "Why?" "Because you existed. My parents preferred Adam at first, despite his awful behaviour. I worked so hard to earn their love, and they loved both sons. Differently." Scott shook his head. "Adam was their golden child, and I was just the backup. Adam died. I knew he would. How could he not with his lifestyle? But then you appeared, and they made you their favourite. Your father left you the business, the company I invested so much in. Is that fair? Take it," James pleaded. "I don't want it. I'll sign everything over to you." He realised he was fighting for his life now. The business meant nothing compared to survival. But Scott was beyond reason, driven by both greed and deep-seated hatred. "You'll say anything now. I want you gone." Scott stepped aside, and his men advanced on James. Despite his screams for mercy, they attacked. A blow to his nose blurred his vision. Then came a sharp pain in his head, and everything faded to black. Later, James woke up on the riverbank, wet, injured, but alive. Scott believed the job was finished. His hired men had thrown what they thought was a lifeless body into the river, expecting it to surface downstream days later. They planned to dismiss it as a robbery gone wrong. But things didn't go as planned. The body was never found. James was reported missing, but Scott wasn't concerned. He had witnessed his nephew's seemingly fatal injuries himself. If the body never surfaced, well, that was fine too. In 5 years, he'll be declared dead, and then Scott will be the sole heir of his parents. He would get everything: the money, the house, and, most importantly, the business. The plan seemed flawless until James showed up at the house. It happened just as the will was being announced, just like in a movie. Scott's mother had recently died of a heart attack, having never lost hope that her grandson was alive. She had written her will accordingly. If James returned, the business would be his. If not, it would go to her son. Scott had thought James's return impossible, and yet he appeared in the living room at the moment of the announcement of the will, and, judging by his nephew's face, he remembered everything, knew everything, understood everything. What had he waited so long for? Later, Scott learned that all this time, James remembered nothing about himself, led a life almost like a bum. Now, James struggled to focus on his report. Numbers blurred before his eyes as his mind wandered. He questioned his decision not to report Scott to the police. Instead, he had let Scott go with his inheritance, agreeing that he would start a new life far away and forget everything, or face police investigation and prosecution. Scott had agreed and left, but would he keep his word? James sighed. Living with the knowledge that someone harboured such hatred toward him was unsettling. Yet he had many people who loved him, though he couldn't bring his grandmother back, and it pained him that she died never knowing he was safe. He had Celine. They would marry soon, and also he was going to repay everyone he knew who had been kind to him all this time. Claire, Remy, Frank, and of course Helen. James appreciated their participating in his life and realized how fortunate he was.